The most painful sentence my wife ever said to me wasn't, "I want a divorce." It was, "I think we need a break." Because divorce is a gunshot. It's loud. It's final. It tells you exactly what just died. But a break? A break is slower than death. A break is watching your marriage bleed out while the person you still love stands there telling you not to panic. A break is hope being used against you. And 3 weeks after my wife asked for one, she came back, stood in the kitchen we painted together, looked me in the eyes and said, "Divorce me." When I asked her why, she didn't cry. She didn't even look surprised that I needed a reason. She just lowered her head for a second, took a breath like she had rehearsed it 100 times, and said, "Because I already gave what belonged to us to someone else." That was the moment my whole life split into 2 parts. The life I thought I had, and the truth. My name is Ethan Carter. I'm 38 years old, born and raised in Ohio, and until that night, I believed I understood what kind of man I was, what kind of woman my wife was, and what kind of marriage we had. I was wrong about all 3. Claire and I had been married for 11 years. Not 11 fake years. Not 11 social media smile years. I mean real years. Years with mortgage payments and flu seasons, and burnt dinners, and long drives home in silence, because one of us was stressed, and the other one was smart enough not to push. Years where love looked less like fireworks and more like remembering how she took her coffee. Years where she would toss her cold feet under my legs in bed, and I would complain every single time, even though both of us knew I secretly loved that she still reached for me in her sleep. We met at 24 in Indianapolis, at a charity 10K neither of us actually wanted to run. She was wearing an old college hoodie, her hair tied up in a careless knot, and she laughed when she saw me stretching like I was training for the Olympics. She said, "You know this is just a fundraiser, right? Not the Boston Marathon." I said, "You know some of us peak in warm-up exercises." She laughed so hard she snorted, got embarrassed, and walked ahead of me. I spent the next 3 miles trying to make her laugh again. That was Claire. She wasn't loud. She wasn't dramatic. She wasn't the kind of woman who needed every eye in the room. But if she smiled at you, really smiled, it felt like being chosen. I chased that feeling for 11 years, and for a long time, I thought she chased it with me too. We built a good life. I worked as a project manager for a residential construction company. Long hours sometimes, especially during summer contracts, but it paid well. Claire was a pediatric nurse, and if you know anything about nurses, you know they carry entire storms inside them and still come home asking if you've eaten. She was that kind of person, the kind who remembered people's birthdays, the kind who cried over animal rescue commercials, the kind who once drove 40 minutes in the rain because her elderly neighbor mentioned she was out of cat food. She was gentle in a world that rewards coldness. That's part of why what happened later nearly broke my mind. Because when a cruel person hurts you, at least the math makes sense. But when a tender person betrays you, you start questioning reality itself. You start wondering whether kindness was just camouflage. If I'm telling this story honestly, then I have to admit something hard. Our marriage had changed long before she asked for that break. It didn't collapse overnight. It eroded. Quietly, like a shoreline. 2 years before everything ended, Claire got pregnant. We hadn't even been trying that long. We'd talked about kids, sure, but always with that careful tone couples use when they don't want to jinx their own happiness. Then, one Saturday morning, she walked into the bathroom holding a test with shaking hands, smiling and crying at the same time. I can still see her, barefoot on the tile, sunlight on her face, hope everywhere. For 7 weeks, we were different people, softer people. We whispered in bed about names. We argued about nursery colors. We downloaded apps. We laughed over fruit comparisons. Your baby is the size of a blueberry. Your baby is the size of a raspberry. Like love could be measured in produce. Then one Monday afternoon, while I was at work, she called me. I knew before I picked up. Nobody says your name like that, unless something holy has been damaged. By the time I got to the hospital, it was over. There are losses people can see. And then there are losses that leave no witness except the two people who were planning a future that now has nowhere to go. That miscarriage took something from both of us, but it took it differently. Claire turned inward. I turned practical. I buried myself in overtime because fixing things was the only language I knew. I told myself I was being strong. I told myself I was giving us stability. I told myself paying bills, finishing projects, keeping life moving meant I was loving her. But grief is not impressed by efficiency. Claire didn't need a husband who could keep the lights on. She needed one who could sit in the dark with her. And I failed at that. I didn't cheat. I didn't lie. I didn't stop loving her. But I failed to understand how lonely a woman can feel, even while sleeping beside a man who thinks he is doing everything right. That matters. Not because it excuses what she did. Nothing excuses betrayal. But if you want a story to feel real, then you have to allow the truth to be messy. People don't just wake up evil. Sometimes they break in private and then make selfish choices in the name of survival. The problem is, their survival usually becomes somebody else's ruin. After the miscarriage, Claire changed slowly. She still went to work. She still laughed sometimes. She still asked me if I wanted anything from the grocery store. But she became harder to reach, like there was glass between us. She spent more time on the porch at night, more time looking at her phone and then turning it face down when I walked in. More time saying, "I'm just tired," with a tone that told me she needed me to stop asking. I noticed all of it. I just interpreted it the wrong way. That's one of the cruelest parts of betrayal. The signs are there. They just wear innocent clothes until it's too late. About 8 months before she asked for the break, Claire transferred to a new children's hospital unit in Columbus. Better hours, slightly better pay, more opportunities, she said. I was proud of her. I took her out for steak the night she got the offer. I told her this was a fresh start. She smiled, but it wasn't her full smile. I remember that now because memory becomes a scavenger after heartbreak. It goes back through every room, every conversation, every silence, looking for what it missed. At first, the new job seemed good for her. She came home with stories again. Not patient details, of course, but moments. A little boy who insisted his dinosaur bandage had special powers. A mother who hugged Claire for staying past her shift. A coworker who always stole the good yogurt from the break room. I was happy to hear life in her voice again. Then, gradually, one name started showing up more than the others. Caleb. Just Caleb. Then Caleb said this. Caleb covered my shift. Caleb knows a great Thai place near the hospital. Caleb is hilarious. I didn't think much of it, because Caleb Foster had been my friend before he was her coworker's friend group addition. Not best man at my wedding close. But close enough to sit at our table. Close enough to come over for football Sundays. Close enough to know where we kept the spare key. I met Caleb through work years earlier. He handled commercial flooring contracts and had this easy, laid-back personality that made people trust him fast. He was divorced, no kids, always had a story, always knew how to read a room. He could be charming without looking like he was trying, which in hindsight is exactly the kind of man you should watch more carefully. Still, I trusted him. And I trusted her, so when she mentioned his name more often, I filed it under coincidence. Then came the first lie I can clearly identify now. One Friday, Claire texted me and said the unit was short-staffed and she'd be late. No problem, I wrote back. I ordered takeout and waited. At 10:30, she came home smelling like restaurant smoke and a perfume she didn't own. Not strong. Just enough. I asked if she'd eaten at the hospital cafe. She said, yeah, they had some greasy special tonight. It was awful. At the time, I kissed her forehead and let it go. Months later, I found the credit card charge. A wine bar downtown. 2 entrees. 1 tab. 9:14 p.m. That's what betrayal does. It turns ordinary memories into crime scenes. After that night, there were more little shifts. She bought new clothes but said they were on sale. She started going to the gym, which would have been great except she had never once in 11 years cared about deadlifts or interval training. She laughed at texts and then pretended she wasn't. She became protective of her phone with the kind of calm that is somehow more suspicious than panic. I asked once, lightly, should I be jealous of this mystery texter? And she smiled without looking at me and said, it's probably more boring than you think. That sentence haunted me later. Because sometimes a lie isn't obvious from its words. It's obvious from how carefully it avoids the truth. The night she asked for the break was a Tuesday in October. Cold rain. Wind against the windows. One of those nights where the whole world sounds like it's trying not to cry too loudly. I had picked up Chinese food. Her favorite sesame chicken, extra sauce, no mushrooms. I remember that because pain brands details into you. I remember the takeout bag on the counter. I remember the condensation on the containers. I remember the way she stood in the doorway between the kitchen and living room with both arms folded, like she needed to physically hold herself together long enough to ruin me. She said, "Can we talk?" I joked, "You sound like HR." She didn't smile. And in that instant, every part of me knew. I just didn't know how bad. We sat at the table. The food stayed in the bag. She looked exhausted, but not confused, not conflicted, just tired in that way people look when they've already made peace with a decision you're still about to hear. She said, "Ethan, I can't do this right now." I asked, "Do what?" She pressed her lips together. "This marriage. This version of us. I feel like I'm disappearing." My chest tightened. "Then let's fix it." She shook her head. "I don't know if it can be fixed." "Since when?" "Since a long time ago." That answer made me angry, because I had been present for all of our days, and somehow still missed the funeral. I said, "You don't get to tell me it's been broken forever when you never told me how bad it was." She looked at me then, and her eyes filled, but the tears didn't fall. "I tried, Ethan. Maybe not clearly enough. Maybe not the way you needed. But I tried. I wish I could tell you I stayed calm. I didn't. I asked if there was someone else. She said no." Too fast. That should have told me everything. Instead, I wanted so badly for her answer to be true that I accepted the speed of it as indignation instead of guilt. Then, she said the words that still make my stomach turn when I hear them in my head. "I need a break. Just a few weeks. Some space to think, to breathe, to figure out what I want." What she meant was this: I need distance from the vows I'm about to break so I can do it without hearing them echo. But of course, she didn't say that. People rarely announce their betrayal in honest language before they're ready to lose your love. I asked where she would go. She said her sister Megan had room. I asked if she was really doing this. She whispered, "Please don't make this uglier than it already is." I almost laughed at that, as if the ugliness had started with my reaction, as if I were the danger in the room. I didn't beg. Not then. I asked if she still loved me. She covered her mouth and cried, and if you've ever been in that position, you know how evil hope can be, because her tears made me believe there was still something left to save. She packed 1 suitcase that night. Just 1. Enough clothes for a few weeks. Toothbrush, skincare bag, phone charger, the blue sweater I bought her in Vermont. She left her wedding album on the shelf, left the framed beach photo in the hallway, left the blanket she always used on the couch. I took that as a sign she meant to come back. I would later understand it differently. She left those things because the version of herself in those memories was already gone. The first week without her felt unreal. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just wrong. Silence in the house had weight. The bedroom felt too large. The bathroom mirror became unbearable because it showed me a man trying to act normal inside a life that no longer fit. I still went to work. I still answered emails. I still sat through project meetings where men discussed materials and deadlines while my marriage floated somewhere outside my body like a car accident I hadn't reached yet. Claire texted every other day. Short messages. Hope you're okay. Just need a little more time. Please don't hate me. I miss home. Read that last one again. I miss home. Not I miss you. Not I'm sorry. Not I made a mistake. I miss home. Even then, some part of me knew she was grieving a place, not a person. Still, I answered gently. Take your time. I love you. We can fix this. If you need anything, call me. That's the humiliating truth of loving someone who is already halfway out the door. You keep offering water to the person drowning you. By the second week, people started asking questions. My sister Ava noticed first. Ava has the kind of soul that can hear damage through silence. She came by on a Sunday with coffee and banana bread and took one look at me before saying, "What happened?" I told her Claire needed space. Ava sat back and narrowed her eyes. Space from what? I shrugged. Ava said nothing for a full 10 seconds, which is a dangerous amount of quiet from a woman like my sister. Then she asked, "Do you think there's somebody else?" And I said the saddest sentence I've ever spoken, with complete sincerity. No. Claire wouldn't do that. Ava didn't argue. That was mercy. The truth already had enough knives in it. The third week was when the floor started giving way. Little things. A charge on our shared credit card that Claire forgot to move. A gas purchase near Caleb's apartment. A mutual friend mentioning she'd seen Claire downtown looking surprisingly happy after I had spent the previous night staring at our ceiling, wondering if grief made noise. Then came the moment I can never unsee. I was at a hardware store after work, standing in line with paint samples, when I looked through the window and saw Caleb's truck pull into the parking lot across the street at a coffee place. Claire got out of the passenger side. She wasn't crying. She wasn't conflicted. She was laughing. And then she touched his arm with the kind of familiarity you don't develop in 3 weeks. I froze. Every instinct in me wanted to storm across that street, drag the truth into daylight, force both of them to say it where I could hear it with my own ears. But something stopped me. Maybe pride. Maybe shock. Maybe the final cowardice of a man whose heart already knew and simply wasn't ready for confirmation. So I stood there holding paint cards while my marriage turned into evidence. That night, I called her. I asked where she'd been. She said Megan's. I said, "Don't lie to me, silence." Then she said, "I'm tired, Ethan." That broke something in me. Not because of the lie itself, because of how casual it was. Like my pain was an inconvenience. Like truth was heavy, and she preferred to travel light. 3 days later, she came home. Not to stay. To end it. I heard her key in the door just after 6. I was in the kitchen washing a coffee mug I had already washed once because I couldn't think of anything else to do with my hands. She stepped in wearing jeans, a black coat, and a face I no longer recognized. She looked older. Not by years, by choices. She set her purse on the counter and said, "We need to talk." And there it was, the cliché. The execution phrase. I didn't sit. She didn't either. She looked around the kitchen like she was visiting a house she used to own. Then she said it. "Ethan, I want a divorce." The room went still. I had imagined that moment in nightmares, but the real thing was quieter than fear. Real pain is often quiet. It doesn't need performance. It just enters your body and starts rearranging your future. I asked, "Why?" She closed her eyes for 1 second. Just one. Then opened them and gave me the answer that still cuts cleaner than any scream could. Because I already gave what belonged to us to someone else. I stared at her. I knew what she meant. But betrayal is such a violent language that your mind asks for translation anyway. I said, "Say it clearly." Her chin trembled. "I was with someone else." "With who?" She cried then. Finally. Finally, when honesty had no more use for her. With Caleb for a second, I honestly thought I might black out. Not because my wife had cheated. Because my wife had cheated with a man who had eaten at my table. A man who had slapped my shoulder, called me brother, borrowed my tools, sat in my backyard holding a beer while telling me I was lucky to have a woman like Claire. I took 2 steps back and leaned against the counter. The kitchen felt warped, too bright, too sharp. I asked, "How long?" She whispered, "A few months. That's the thing about the truth once it starts. It never arrives alone. A few months. Not one mistake. Not one bad night. Not one emotional lapse. A few months of messages. A few months of lies. A few months of kissing me with a mouth that had already learned another name." I said, "Before the break?" She nodded. That nod nearly destroyed me more than the confession itself. Because the break had been the part I was still trying to honor. I had treated her request like pain. It had really been strategy. I laughed then, but there was no humor in it. So the break wasn't for clarity. She said nothing. I answered for her. It was permission. She cried harder and said, "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." I wanted to throw something. Instead, I asked the most human, humiliating question a betrayed husband can ask. "Why him?" She covered her face. "I don't know." "Don't do that." "What?" "Don't insult me twice. You know exactly why him." She dropped her hands and looked at me with bloodshot eyes. And then she said something I hated, because part of it was true. "He was there when you weren't." I wish that sentence had been enough to make me hate her completely. It would have been easier. But pain is crueler than that. Because yes, I had buried myself in work. Yes, I had mishandled grief. Yes, I had mistaken responsibility for intimacy. But none of that changed the next truth that came out of my mouth. "So instead of telling me you were lonely, you slept with my friend?" She sobbed and said, "It started as talking. There are sentences cheaters say that sound almost comical if they weren't attached to somebody else's broken life. It started as talking. As if destruction only counts once clothes hit the floor. As if intimacy begins in the body and not in the secrecy. As if every deleted text and hidden smile and private confession wasn't already a theft. I asked, "Do you love him?" That question sat between us like glass. She took too long to answer. And the delay was my answer. Finally, she said, "I don't know what I feel anymore." There it was again. Cowardice dressed up as confusion. I nodded slowly, because anger had moved somewhere deeper by then. Not gone, just colder. I asked, "Is that why you want the divorce? Because you want to be with him?" She swallowed and whispered, "I think I owe you the freedom to hate me honestly, instead of pretending this can still be repaired." You ever hear someone say something almost noble while standing in the wreckage they caused? That was Claire. She wanted credit for telling the truth after months of lying. She wanted grace for confessing only once concealment became exhausting. I said, "No. Don't rewrite this as mercy. You're not setting me free. You already did what you wanted. This is just the paperwork catching up." She cried harder. I didn't comfort her. That was the first boundary I set. and it felt like cutting off my own hand. She tried to explain how she and Caleb had started talking after long shifts, how he knew what to say, how he listened when she talked about the miscarriage, how he made her feel seen, how one night after drinks she kissed him in his truck and spent the next week promising herself it would never happen again, how again came sooner than her guilt did, how by the time she asked me for the break, she was already split in two and too ashamed to say it. Every word was another nail. Because the details don't help. People think they do. They don't. They just give your nightmares furniture. When she finished, I asked one last question. Did you ever plan to tell me if I hadn't started seeing signs? She looked at me and said nothing. That silence told me more than any confession. No, she would have let me keep loving a lie until the lie chose its own exit. I walked to the front door and opened it. She stared at me. I said, "Get out, Ethan. Get out before I say something I'll regret for the rest of my life." She picked up her purse with shaking hands. At the door, she turned like maybe there was a script where I stopped her, where love outran humiliation, where 11 years rose up and saved us. They didn't. She left, and I sank to the kitchen floor like the bones had been taken out of me. People talk a lot about heartbreak, but they don't talk enough about humiliation. That's the part that crawls under your skin, not just that the person you loved betrayed you, but that you stood there, loyal and sincere, while being made a fool in your own life. That night, I called Caleb. He answered on the third ring. Casual. "Hey man, that man almost made me throw up." I said, "I know," silence. Then, "Ethan, I can explain. I laughed so hard it scared me." "Explain what? Which part? Sleeping with my wife, or shaking my hand while you did it?" He started talking, fast, messy, full of phrases like "didn't mean for this to happen," and "never wanted to hurt you," and things got complicated. You want to know what the most insulting thing about betrayal is? It's how ordinary the excuses are. People destroy your life and then describe it like bad weather. Things got complicated. No, you made choices. Repeatedly, comfortably, in secret. I asked him how long he had been coming into my house while sleeping with my wife. He said, "Please don't do this." And that was when I realized cowards are always terrified of the tone truth takes when it stops being polite. I said, "You were in my backyard in August. We grilled burgers. You asked me for my hot sauce. Then 2 days later you were in a hotel with my wife. Were you laughing at me then, or just after?" He didn't answer. I hung up before rage turned me into somebody I didn't want to become. The weeks that followed were ugly in the most boring ways. Lawyers, emails, asset lists. The practical language of emotional demolition. Claire moved fully into Megan's place at first. Then, I heard through mutual friends, into Caleb's apartment. That one hurt less than I expected. By then, the wound had moved past shock into numbness. What gutted me more were the small absences. Her mug in the cabinet. Her handwriting on old grocery lists. A bobby pin in the bathroom drawer. The indentation on her side of the mattress slowly disappearing, like even the bed was learning not to expect her. Ava practically moved in for a while. Not literally, but enough. She stocked my fridge. She sat with me when I couldn't sleep. She never said "I told you so," even though she probably had every right to think it. One night, after too much bourbon and not enough dignity, I asked her, "What's wrong with me?" She looked furious. Not at me, at the question. She said, "Nothing is wrong with you because someone else lacked character." I said, "I wasn't enough." Ava leaned forward and said something I still carry. "Being betrayed does not mean you were deficient. It means someone else saw your trust as a discount." That line saved me in ways she'll never fully know. Because if you've been cheated on, You understand the insanity of self-blame. You compare yourself to the other person. Were they funnier? More attractive? More emotionally available? Less tired? Less damaged? More exciting? You stand in front of the mirror and negotiate with your own worth like it's up for public review. I did all of that. And some nights, I lost those arguments badly. But healing started the day I accepted a brutal truth. I had flaws. I had blind spots. I had failed my marriage in ordinary, human ways. But I had not betrayed it. That distinction matters. One is imperfection. The other is treason. About 3 months into the separation, Claire called me late one evening. I almost didn't answer, but grief makes you stupid long after wisdom arrives. So I picked up. Her voice was soft, small. Hi. I didn't say her name. She asked how I was. I said, "Why are you calling?" There was a pause. Then she said, "I just wanted to hear your voice." That sentence made me close my eyes. Because the same mouth that had once spoken my favorite promises was now using nostalgia like a key. I said, "You don't get to miss me like I died. I'm alive. You left." She started crying. I stayed silent. Then she said the thing I think she had really called to say. Things with Caleb aren't what I thought. And there it was. The final insult. Not just betrayal, but the possibility that I was now being contacted because betrayal had become inconvenient. I asked, "Are you asking for sympathy?" "No." "Then what are you asking for?" She sobbed quietly and said, "I don't know, that used to work on me. Not anymore." I told her, "For months, confusion was your shield. Use a different word." She whispered, "I made a mistake." I said, "No. A mistake is forgetting an anniversary. A mistake is backing into a mailbox. You built another relationship while sleeping beside me. That wasn't a mistake. That was a campaign." She went quiet. Then, so softly I almost didn't hear it, she said, "I miss who we were." I took a long breath before answering. "So do I. But you didn't destroy who we are. You destroyed who we were. And that version of us is dead." I hung up shaking. Not because I missed her. I did. Not because I wanted her back. By then I didn't. I shook because closure is not peace. Sometimes closure is just choosing not to reopen the wound. The divorce was finalized 6 months later. No screaming courtroom scene. No dramatic last-minute confession. Just signatures. A judge. A hallway. A finished thing. Claire looked thinner. Tired, not glamorous tired. Consequences tired. She tried to catch my eye more than once, but I kept my attention on the paperwork. At one point, while we waited for the attorneys, she said, "I'm sorry." I believed. She meant it. That's another hard truth people don't like hearing. Sometimes the person who betrayed you is genuinely sorry. Sometimes they do regret it. Sometimes they wake up and realize they burned down a good life for a temporary fire. But regret is not restoration. An apology can acknowledge damage. It cannot reverse it. So I looked at her and said, "I know." She cried. I didn't. By then, my tears had changed shape. They no longer came out of my eyes. They came out in habits. In silence. In the way I paused before entering a quiet house. In the way I sometimes still reached for my phone before remembering there was no one to text that I was on my way home. After the divorce, I sold the house. Not because I had to. Because I couldn't breathe in it anymore. Too many ghosts. Too many versions of me still walking around, believing in something that no longer existed. I bought a smaller place, 30 minutes away. A modest brick home with a wide porch and terrible wallpaper in the dining room. The first night there, sitting on the floor with takeout and half-opened boxes, I felt something I hadn't felt in a year. Not happiness, but relief. Relief that every room no longer belonged to a memory I was trying to survive. I started therapy. I'm not ashamed to say that. In fact, I wish more men would admit when grief is bigger than pride. My therapist, Dr. Elena Ruiz, once told me, "You're trying to understand betrayal as if it followed your moral logic." It didn't. That's why it feels impossible. That changed me. Because I had been trying to solve my pain like a math problem. If I found the exact reason, maybe it would hurt less. If I understood why Claire chose Caleb, maybe I could place the suffering somewhere logical. But betrayal doesn't obey neat equations. Sometimes the answer is simply this. Someone wanted comfort without accountability, excitement without sacrifice, validation without honesty. And you were the one standing in the blast zone. About a year after the divorce, I ran into Megan at a grocery store. Claire's sister. She looked awkward, apologetic by association. We talked politely for a minute about weather, work, life, then she said, "Claire moved out of Caleb's place months ago." I said nothing. Megan hesitated, then added, "It fell apart fast, of course it did. That's the tragedy and the irony of affairs. They often feed on fantasy and die in daylight. When secrecy disappears, so does the illusion that what they built was special. Suddenly there are bills and moods and ordinary flaws and the unbearable truth that if someone betrayed with you, they might betray you too." Megan looked at me like maybe she thought I'd feel vindicated. I didn't. Just tired. There is no real victory in being proven right after your heart has already paid the price. A few weeks after that, Claire sent me a letter, handwritten, 3 pages. I almost threw it away. Instead, I read it on the porch at sunset like a man reopening a wound just to confirm it still had nerve. She wrote that she had confused attention for love, that after the miscarriage, she felt invisible in her own body, and Caleb made her feel chosen at a time when she no longer knew how to choose herself. She wrote that the break had been cowardly, that she asked for space because she couldn't admit what she had already done. She wrote that every kind thing I said during those 3 weeks made her feel worse, not better, because my decency exposed how small she had become. That line was probably the most honest thing she ever gave me. She wrote that Caleb lost interest once real life replaced secrecy, that he didn't know how to love pain, only distract it, that she spent months living with the knowledge that she had traded permanence for adrenaline and called it freedom. And then near the end she wrote this, "You were the safest place I ever had," and I burned it down because I was too broken to sit still inside my own grief. I folded the letter and stared at the horizon for a long time after that, because part of healing is accepting that the person who hurt you may finally tell the truth long after truth can save anything. I never wrote back, not out of cruelty, out of respect for the life I was building. Some doors don't need slamming, they just need staying closed. Today, when people hear the short version of my story, they usually focus on the obvious parts. The affair, the friend, the divorce. But the most important part wasn't losing Claire. It was losing the version of me who thought love alone could protect a man from betrayal. I don't believe that anymore. Love is beautiful. Love is necessary. But love without honesty is just emotional debt. Love without courage is theater. Love without loyalty is a funeral waiting for a date. I did love Claire. Deeply, honestly, in the ordinary, unglamorous, lifelong way that actually means something. And for a long time, I hated myself for not being able to save that marriage. Now, I know better. You cannot save something another person is secretly setting on fire. The last time I saw Claire was almost 2 years after the divorce. I was leaving a bookstore downtown, coffee in hand, when I noticed someone standing by the curb. It was her. She looked up and saw me. For a second, we were suspended there between history and strangers. She gave a small, sad smile. Not flirtation. Not hope. Just recognition. I walked over because time had sanded down the sharpest edges by then. We talked for maybe 3 minutes. Weather, work, her mother's health. Nothing intimate. Nothing dangerous. Then, she looked at me with those same eyes I once trusted more than my own future and said, "You look peaceful." I thought about that. Then, I said, I had to become someone you couldn't reach anymore. She nodded like she understood. Maybe she did. Maybe that was finally her punishment. Not loneliness. Not regret, but the permanent knowledge that she had once been loved by a man who would have stayed, and she traded him for a feeling that didn't even know how to last. We said goodbye. No drama. No music. No miracle. Just 2 people standing in the consequences of choices that could never be unchosen. I watched her walk away, and for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to follow even with my eyes. That's how I knew I was free. So if you're asking what happened when my wife came back 3 weeks after asking for a break and said, "Divorce me," this is the truth. She came back carrying another man's fingerprints on a marriage I had spent 11 years protecting. She came back with a confession where vows used to be. She came back after turning space into secrecy and confusion into betrayal. And when I asked her why, she told me she had already given what belonged to us to someone else. But if you stay with me to the real end of this story, then hear this part carefully. Her betrayal was not the end of my life. It was the end of my illusion. The illusion that being loyal guarantees being chosen. The illusion that good people cannot make devastating choices. The illusion that heartbreak only happens to weak men or broken marriages. Sometimes betrayal walks straight into a decent home, sits at a familiar table, smiles at you, and waits until you lower your guard. And when it finally leaves, it takes more than trust. It takes your innocence. But here's what it could not take from me. My name. My integrity. My ability to love honestly. My refusal to become cruel just because cruelty visited me. Claire lost those things in herself long before I lost her. That's the part I understand now. And if there is one line I would leave behind for any man or woman trying to survive a story like mine, it's this. When someone asks for a break, don't just listen to their words. Listen to the distance in them. Because sometimes I need space does not mean help me heal. Sometimes it means I've already left you in my heart, and I'm looking for a kinder sentence than the truth. I thought my marriage ended the day Claire asked for a divorce. It didn't. It ended the day she chose to seek comfort in the arms of the one person who should have respected our home. The divorce was just the paperwork. The real ending happened in secret. And the real beginning? That came later. Quietly, the day I stopped asking why I wasn't enough for the wrong person and started asking why I had begged the wrong person to stay. That question gave me my life back. And that is how I learned that sometimes the most heartbreaking love stories are not about losing someone else. They're about losing the version of yourself that would have accepted less than you deserved.